likely to delegate tasks to them, which especially in teams is very critical if we're going to take advantage of the team dynamics. We're more kind to people that we trust. We're more forgiving of people that we trust. The organization itself as sort of a reference, and in the leaders as agents of that organization. So it's basically been looked at every organizational level, and it all kind of corresponds to there are benefits for trust at all of those levels. It's also been really highlighted lately in terms of current times. So the pandemic has really emphasized how critical trust is and just how hard it can be to establish. When things are bad, when there's crisis and uncertainty, people want and need connection and certainty. They're seeking for things to feel certain about, for people to feel connected to. And organizations right now are reporting that they're struggling to maintain trust with their employee base, to keep their employees engaged during this crisis. And so really what this is just saying is that social connection and interaction have been more difficult lately, especially given the virtual settings, socially distant settings, general anxiety, well-being issues that are happening with everyone all at the same time. And that makes building trust more difficult. But at the exact same time, it's also even more important to do it. So you end up in this fun catch-22 where it's very difficult to get, but it's exactly the thing you need, which is why it's so important to stop and really think about what you can do to improve this situation. So now I'm going to jump to a couple of frameworks that talk about different types of trust, and I'll start with a caveat that there's no right framework. I think that these are all useful tools for thinking about what trust can mean to you, to your colleagues, to your subordinates, your supervisors, whoever you're working with and are trying to improve relationships with. But these are the way the literature has broken up types of trust. One framework approaches it from an affect or a cognition-based approach, and that there's an assumption that some trust is built on feelings and emotions and an affective connection to another person, whereas other forms of trust are built off of our knowledge, sort of the calculus around relationships. It's a lot more transactional in nature, and that's cognition-based trust. And obviously, there's some implications here in terms of what these types of trust then mean in terms of how we interact with individuals if you have developed affect-based trust versus cognition-based trust. But there's an assumption here that you can have both types with any particular relationship, right? So in an ideal situation, you would trust for both reasons. Another way to look at this is more of sources of trust rather than types of trust, but it depends on how you want to define it. There's also a 3-stage model that was put forth by Lewicki and Bunker that talks about how trust sort of develops over time in most relationships. And so this suggests that you start off most newly formed relationships with what's known as calculus-based trust. And that's that you have determined there is something worth having in this relationship, and so you're now willing to take the risk of engaging in it without much information to go off of, right? So you're doing some calculus and you've gone, okay, benefits outweigh the risks, I'm gonna have this relationship, I'm gonna work with this person, I'm going to engage with this person. And that's some relationships in the workplace. The next stage, after you've gotten into some interactions, you're getting to know a human being, you've seen them perform, you're starting to get a sense of what's going on, that's knowledge-based trust. It means you know something about their performance, about what you can expect in terms of what they will do in the future. And that's where most relationships are in the workplace. And again, I'll caveat here that this is very westernized research. So when I say in the workplace, I'm mostly referring to Western US-based types of workplace settings. We know that based on the character we believe that they have, right? That it's not just that I know that you're dependable as a worker, but I know you're a good human and I connect to you as a good human. And so we've got this trust that's very rich and very identification oriented. And again, in this particular context, it's assumed that only a few relationships tend to get to that level of identification-based trust. But obviously the goal is to get to the highest level of trust because that's where you're going to have the most benefits. But at the same time, knowledge-based trust is often completely sufficient for the kinds of interactions we're having at work, but it depends, of course. So this is just one framework of trust. Let me, where did my actual, oops. Oh, geez, that is not what I meant to do. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so just reiterating here that there are no right or wrong frameworks of trust here. These dimensional models just tend to remind us that trust is complex. That's really the biggest lesson here, is that trust is often multifaceted. It comes from multiple elements of the relationships we have with people, and it's not as simple as meeting one single expectation. There's often very interwoven expectations. These are just some of the typical frameworks that you see in the science of trust. I'll throw out one more that I happen to be a fan of, and that is the one that separates trust and distrust. So there is one theoretical perspective that argues that trust and distrust are very, very related, but separate constructs. And I like this because I think if you've ever experienced this high level of distrust, where you truly have confident, negative expectations of another person, your behavioral response to that is very different than an absence of trust. Absence of trust gives you like uncertainty, maybe I'll wait and see kind of a response. Strong distrust means I'm making contingency plans, I'm double checking behind your back, I'm finding workarounds to avoid you at work because I know you're gonna mess up my thing. That's very different, right? And so this approach to trust really talks about the fact that you can have relationships that actually could have high trust and high distrust, maybe across different contexts. I trust you very much in this area, but not at all in this other area. Or you could have low trust, low distrust, essentially just a very much an absence of certainty. I just don't know yet. So that you can have these combinations of trust and distrust that result in very different emotional experiences, like how I feel about that. Am I feeling fear and I'm skepticism, cynicism, or am I feeling lots of confidence, lots of assurance? Basically, I'm worry-free because I've got so much trust in you. And I like that this really emphasizes that affective piece of things. So what builds trust? This is probably the piece that you're hoping to see the answer to, but I'm actually going to walk through what builds trust, what breaks trust, and then what repairs trust, because I think one of the things we have to recognize is that you may not get it right the first time, right? The ultimate goal is to build it to begin with and to never mess that up, but how many of us are completely infallible and won't make a mistake? Probably no one. So knowing how to repair trust is also really helpful. So this is a recent article was published. Javidan and Zahir in 2020 put out a very practical piece that just talked about how you build trust in global team settings. And they actually did focus groups here with over 700 managers from all across the globe and built frameworks that were separate for sort of US-based settings and then in other cultural settings. And their baseline proposition here was that trust relationships are embedded in a cultural context, and that cultures, in this case, countries, they vary super widely, not just in how trusting they are in general, and that's what this map shows, is that different countries tend to be more or less trusting overall as a propensity, and this is often driven by historical context, resource scarcity. If a country has gone through a lot and is struggling a lot, you often see a lot of distrust in that culture just because people are scared and are worried about things, and that's where you start to see lack of trust in society, in governmental institutions, etc. But at the same time, the importance of trust is universal. Whether or not a country has more or less trust does not mean trust is not important there, right? Everybody wants to be able to trust, and trust is critical to most relationships, regardless of how much of it you have. So they wanted to look and see, we assume that trust is built the same way everywhere, but is that true? It's probably not. So they started looking to see if there are differences in that. And as an example, to put that out there, they looked at dictionary definitions of trust from multilingual dictionaries. And when you look at English dictionaries, the only dictionaries that mention concepts like ability and effectiveness were the American or English-based dictionaries. When you looked at dictionaries from China, Turkey, Spain, Portugal, Arabic dictionaries, etc., they mostly emphasize personal character and honesty, right? So you're starting to see differences in what builds trust. Trust is very important. Trust is defined in all of these cultures, but what it is looks kind of different. So in these interviews, they distilled this down to like, what are US managers saying is important for trust, and what is everyone else saying is important for trust? And in the American way, as they call it in this article, this is how you build trust. You're follow a code of ethics, stick to that. You deliver results, you're consistent. You can feel the like American, right? Get it done right, get it done really well. And that, again, makes sense in working. Most responses had to do with delivering on promises and having the capabilities of doing the job. And they suggest this stems again from our performance orientation in this particular culture. And as a culture researcher, I'll also throw out the caveat that just because a culture is like something in general does not mean every person is. So if you do not identify with this, that's totally expected and normal. But for a lot of professionals, work is literally the #1 priority, and personal relationships are sort of a secondary thing. We just don't think about them. And we even separate them at work, right? There's a lot of compartmentalization. There's boundaries between work and life, and we tend to talk about it like that. When they did the interviews with people from a non-Western perspective, they found very different themes. Now they were talking about style. What is the vibe the person puts out there? Are they friendly? It's very intangible too. It was hard to explain, and it depended on the particular cultural context they were talking about. Do people pick up on implicit social cues and follow those well? Does the person fit with the group? A newcomer has to show enough willingness to integrate, to be part of the new team. That was very critical in these particular interviews. First impressions. Initial presentation of an individual is deemed very important. Friendliness right off the bat was very critical. Social time, and I think I like to focus on this one. Some of these other things, and like, again, as a diversity researcher, I get worried when I see the words, things like first impressions and style, because you can get into some very tricky areas where you essentially start deeming whiteness as being the ideal version of all of those things, and that's not good, right? So those are a little harder to manipulate, but the social time piece is a really easy way to get past some of these differences across what builds trust, right? And that some of these things are hard to control, but this one has clear implications. We can build bonds more easily if we get to know people as people. So maybe your first impressions don't set you off on the right foot because there are differences in cultural assumptions and cultural presentation, but maybe that social time allows you to get past some of those misconceptions or any stereotypes that are unintentionally triggered at the beginning of team formation, right? So the social time piece, I think, is really critical, and we've got a lot of people in ICCM that have had tons of global virtual team experience, lots of expatriate type experience, and you often hear very similar stories, which is like, it's just so critical to stop and sometimes share food, share drink, get to know people, ask about their families. That often is the first step to getting past some of these issues at the beginning of a team formation. So they put forth what they call the 3D process for building trust. And this essentially says you want to discover what the national approaches are to trust in your team. So if your team is multinational or multicultural, get to know what their approach to trust is. Discuss those similarities and differences in trust building, and use that to develop a team-based protocol or a team-based set of norms for how you will build trust. What's going to work for your team, what's going to work for whoever you're working with, right? So this is sort of an individualizing approach. What's funny is, like, this is interesting from a theoretical perspective. It tells us a little bit about what was in this data set, but every team's going to be different. You don't know which, if you're working in certain settings, you could have teams that are comprised of many different nations, and now it's going to be very hard to learn 5 different nations if it's a multinational team that's from 5 different places, and figure all that out. But you can at least talk about it and then find some shared ground, come to an understanding where everybody's on the same page and agrees to go in that direction. So now I want to shift into a little bit of my own research in this area, because I find this very interesting, but I did a very similar study myself. I was funded by the Army Research Institute to develop, or at least start developing. It was an early career grant. I was very early on in my career, and so it was a smaller grant and sort of focused to start developing a theory of trust development, violation, and repair across cultures. And so the first step of that was to, and in fact, most of the funding was oriented towards interviews. We were doing critical incident interviews, very similar to what the other study did, but in this case, I wasn't just looking at trust development, but also that violation and the repair piece. And so our interviews sort of walked people through a set of questions where we asked them first to tell us what trust meant to them, then what developed trust for them, but then also to give us stories about times that trust was lost or violated in the workplace, and then times trust was repaired after it was lost or violated in the workplace. And we tended to focus on the making sure we were getting out those affective or emotional experiences, the cognitive or thought experiences, and also their behavioral reactions. What did it actually change in terms of what they did and how they acted with this relationship? And I did want to give a shout out to my awesome grad students that worked on this, Trevor Fry, Chi Pyun Yen, and Allison Pagan, who all helped me collect the data, analyze the data, et cetera. They were super helpful. They've all gone on and graduated and gotten jobs at this point. So we ended up doing a total of 123 interviews, roughly equal male, female, pretty spread out in age. We did pull from our campus resources. So Florida Tech is a unique university in that we are we hover around 30% international in terms of student population. At one point, at least, was the highest international student population proportion in the country. So we have this fantastic opportunity to get to talk to people who are transplants, who are expatriates over here, and who have had lots of experiences both in their home culture and also acclimating to their host culture over here. So we set out to get subsets of cultures, and we interviewed 30 individuals who are from the US, born in the US, 30 who are from China and identify China as their home country, 32 from India, 31 from the Middle East. At one point, we were trying to get a certain country. However, we just couldn't get like critical mass in a particular country, and so we had to end up going regional for that particular group. But we asked them questions about a number of different experiences. We had people report on experiences in various employment settings, lots of experiences, obviously, since we were pulling from quite a few international students in educational and classroom settings, though I'll also caveat that we had a lot of graduate students who are more like paraprofessionals. So they were reporting on those advisee-advisor kinds of relationships where they were really doing project work and actually very much engaging in active scholarship. And then some extracurricular settings too, sports teams, clubs, and organizations around campus. But point being, we were going for like all interpersonal collaborative settings. When have you worked with somebody, and can you tell us stories about that? What did it come down to? 2 words. Regardless of the stories, the settings, the situations, the culture, it all came down to meeting expectations. So if you want like the too long did it read of the entire presentation, it's this, and actually that's the title of my last slide is that, but it really doesn't matter what the expectations are, and half the time the problem is you don't know what they are, but the goal is to meet them, right? We want reality to meet our expectations. The other thing that was really interesting here in terms of themes is that it didn't matter if those were explicit or implicit expectations. And of course, the bigger issues came about with implicit expectations, when there were expectations that had never been communicated outwardly. They were never spoken, put in a document, included in any sort of kickoff materials. It was just assumed you should know to do these things, right? And that's where you see a lot of issues with trust violation come about. So what were the expectations? We did pull out some themes in terms of the common expectations you saw described. And because again, I think we are working across cultural boundaries here, but they're all in very performance-oriented settings. Performance was a big theme. Even across all cultural groups, you still saw performance come out because they were either talking about getting things done at work or getting things done in classroom teams. And it was just really important that you actually do the work, right? And so you see that people were trusted because they did well in school, they showed up to class prepared, or in the workplace, they get a lot of stuff done, they get it done really well, they go above and beyond. And I love that phrase, and you'll see that a couple places, but going above and beyond is like the bonus points of trust, right? Meeting expectations is the minimum. Going beyond them is where you really start to see some benefit. Predictability. So not just getting it done, but getting it done predictably, every time, on time, never going back on your word. You know what to expect with this person. You notice that they're more reliable, they're more dependable. Faith. So you see some of the words that you all pointed out in that word cloud coming in through these descriptions of what was building trust in these relationships. You also saw a lot of references to benevolence. So again, some people emphasize the performance piece, other people tended to emphasize this benevolence piece, and you did see some cultural differences here where non-US cultures tended to emphasize the benevolence a bit more. He cares about if we're feeling bad, he'll ask you how your day is going. This was a quote given about a manager in a workplace. He's different from a lot of other managers because they don't do that, right? So this had nothing to do with the work, but the trust was being built because that manager was treating the people like people and caring about them as human beings and their well-being. Another quote, just in a team, you know they're looking out for you and the team too, and not just themselves, right? This lack of selfishness or unselfish behavior going out to help the group or help the other person. And then another one in a classroom setting, she helped me because I told her that I don't speak that much of English, and she would explain some stuff to me, and I was really thankful for that. I didn't really expect her to do that. So there's another example here where maybe the expectation wasn't there, but the fact they went above and beyond expectation is what really built the trust in this case. I have no idea what time it is, so I should keep track. Third, fourth, okay. Okay, so then another theme Respect, and you definitely saw this emphasized much more heavily in the Chinese subpopulation. Respect was super important to certain individuals. So if you don't respect each other, if you don't speak in a respectful way, that was very violating of trust. You didn't get trust in that case, right? So they have to be able to share some kind of common values, and first respect, there should be first respect to each other before there is any sort of relationship that is built. And then you also saw responses that implied, even if you also needed to see respect happening in all directions, right? So it's not just respecting me, but showing that you are respectful to everyone, that respect is part of your character. This one I think was slightly unexpected and heavily emphasized in our Middle East subpopulation, confidentiality. So there was in many cases, implicit assumption that when you work with other individuals, that there's quite a bit of information shared between you that is confidential nature. So you would see people describing that they trusted someone because they had not heard one word that I told him from anybody else, so I know that he keeps his secrets, that the information being passed back and forth is confidential. And this is, again, I think something we don't think about in some cases, or at least I don't. Maybe this is just my own personality, but this one didn't click for me. I was like, unless you told me to keep it secret, I don't know if I'd know to do that. But it was assumed that there's some information you should just implicitly know should not be passed along to others. And then I won't go into the rest of them. There were other themes, but I wanted to mention that, this is just a smattering of what else builds trust in these, that we pulled out from these interviews. Honesty was mentioned, timeliness, reciprocity, that there's like an equality in the relationship. So it just depends on what's going on there. Loyalty was mentioned sometimes, integrity as well. And I throw integrity at the end there because it is a heavily emphasized dimension that's mentioned in the trust research. It's not the way people talk about trust, at least in our interviews. Nobody really uses this word, first off. But even when you look at the definition of integrity, having to do with like following a code of ethics or being very ethical, you don't really see that mentioned as much as benevolent. Benevolent's more common. You see more like, well, they'll do what's right for me, but not as much emphasizing those ethics. Now, that said, if you go out and you ask people straight up, is it important to be ethical for you to be trusted? Then you're going to say yes. But I will say that when you ask people just off the top of their head, give you words and thoughts that correspond to trust, ethics is not what comes up at first for most people's brains. I don't know if that's because it's just such a low baseline that it's just assumed not to be mentioned or what, but there's an interesting research question there. But then I'll say that, and then any other spoken or unspoken expectations, right? So in any individual relationship, any team, there could be something other than what I've just mentioned that is expected to happen. And if it does not, you won't have trust built. So I wanted to I will quickly pause this as our reflect and share moment. So I figured I would give you all a couple of minutes to either go take a little break, use the restroom, but jot down some notes on your expectations. What expectations do you all have for others in terms of trusting them when you work with them? Maybe they correspond to what I've said so far. Maybe there's something that I haven't mentioned and you're like, this is absolutely critical. A person must do these things. But hopefully some of you, when we come back in about 2 minutes, will be willing to share some of your thoughts in terms of this. But yeah, what are your expectations? And then the secondary question, do you typically make those explicit? Do you tell people that that's what you expect of them when you start a relationship with them or when you start a new team? And then why or why not? Why haven't you or why have you? So I'm just looking for some experiences and stories in this area in a couple minutes. And I will turn off my video so it doesn't look like I'm staring at you for a second. That I've never experienced in my whole life. No. Yeah, I'm breaking technology in brand new ways. Let me restart my slides and see if that fixes it. No, see, it gives me a second and then it goes away again. I think it might be my Pole EV slide messing with the other ones. Let me delete it. Now try. Yes, I think I just figured it out. Okay, so what expectations do you all have for others when you need, in order to trust them?
I guess I can start. I'm John.
Hi, John.
Hey, Jessica. So I'm going to start off by saying I was born in America, so I'm American. But I also have some, looking at your slides that you showed, I do have some qualities of Asian affect and from my culture. Mm-hmm. And my first word to you was confidence, defining what trust was. I put confidence and discretion. and which is like Middle Eastern-ish. But for me, that's so important. But the things that you mentioned for Americans is also important too. So the thing is, all those things are high in my definition of trust, and I don't say it to people. I expect it.
Yeah.
And in my mind, if I have to tell you, then my trust in you has just been chopped to half or less.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I have to tell you. Now, in the work setting, because we have to work and we have to be verbal in what we say and put our expectations out there, I'm fine with that. As to be a leader or to be a team player, you got to say it so that people can follow it if that's what you want and that's what you need, right? But personally, that's how I am in regards to trust. I'm not saying it. If I do, then you're now seen as different.
Yeah, that's actually part of the expectation, is that you know what they are beforehand, which makes a lot of sense. And actually, I would imagine then too, to some extent, the way you trust at work differs from the way you trust outside of work.
Correct. Right? Yes. So then loyalty comes in when it comes to more personal, social. Now, at work is work. You don't have to have loyalty to do work properly, right? So that's where that because the word loyalty came in, when you gave your lecture too. And I thought, oh yeah, I do. To me, loyalty is high up in there too when it comes to family.
Right.
Not fealty is too extreme, but, right? Yeah, that's too extreme. But loyalty is right up there, especially when it comes to blood and relationships.
Yeah, for sure. And what you'll see too, and I'll talk about this a bit, that you'll see some differences in those personal and work relationships. Sometimes the way that we approach them across cultures, individually and across cultures. Yeah. Any other experiences?
I'll go next,
sure.
if that's okay. There's lots of really interesting stuff, and I'll follow up on what John said. I'm a multicultural, multilingual person, and I definitely noticed those differences that you elucidated, between the American style and the non-North American style. So I think that honestly, being respectful and thinking of others, not being selfish, to me, are where you gain my trust and you lose my trust, because we're not going to get to the point of confidentiality before those basics are met. And I like to say that I judge people by three things, one of which is what you do with your shopping cart. The other one is how you treat animals. And the other one is how you speak to servers.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how I judge you. And that's where, the trust begins. I will say, in the way of saying it implicitly or explicitly, I will agree with John. It really just depends on the setting. In a work setting, I became a supervisor of a group where there was a lot of distrust and disrespect. And one of the things we did at one of our first meetings is I was very clear that there's a certain behavior that I expected, which is to let everyone finish speaking, to be respectful, to not interrupt. And I was very explicit because I was trying to build in a trust in a group that did not have good trust within it.
Right.
And otherwise, a lot of it is implicit. I would agree with John, but since two of my cultures are very direct, I will sometimes straight up tell people, that really makes me lose some trust in you. I expected this of you. But once again, within the context of I won't do that at work, but I will certainly do that with a friend who I thought was a friend. And I'll flat out say, you know what? I don't know if I would consider you a friend anymore because you did X, Y, Z. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so what's interesting too in what you said is that it seems like there can be not just a hierarchy in terms of what's expected, but they're nested. Like you have to meet these expectations before we can even get to those. And so there is these levels of relationship building that you go through. Yeah, for sure. Very cool. All right, so then for the interesting
Can I say something?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Yes. So my background, I have a Chinese background, China background. So in our culture, the criteria we try to build up trust is based on what you do. What do you do? Not only based on what you say. So it's not easy to build up trust from very beginning. So we would like to observe the consistent behavior patterns that can be considered trustful. Then decide this person is trustful or not, and decide whether or not to have long-term collaborations or relationship. Yeah, on the other hand, there's a lot of people, they're very good at saying things, but they may not be very good to commitments and really get things done. So that's type of style or patterns usually will break the trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you speak to one other theme that came out, which is that for some people in some cultures, the trust it's innocent until proven guilty, or guilty until proven innocent, right? And so like in some cases, you don't get trust until it is verified and earned. You've had time to watch and observe and actually build that up. Other people go, I'm just going to assume you're trustworthy from the beginning, and you have to lose it before there's a problem, right? So you see very different individual approaches to that in terms of how quickly you can build up trust, or does it exist without any prior knowledge?
Just a quick question on that. Something that I've always wondered about, is that more of an individual thing or a cultural thing? Because I'm one of those people that starts assuming trust and then I keep getting hurt, and then others are different. So I just always wondered, is it individual more, or is it cultural more? Is it?
This is a hard one because, again, as a culture researcher, I don't know if the answer can be defined as more, because there's definitely both, right? There is within culture variation and across culture variation, and that cultures on average differ from each other in that way. But then of course every individual within that, depending on their multicultural background, their experiences growing up, how they were socialized, the school experience, all the things, right? You can get very different outcomes at that individual level, where people either look like they're prototypical cultural member or they don't. And so it just depends a lot.
I must agree with Yuan and Sophie, what she wrote in there. I feel like the consistency of the two things, of what you say and how you act, needs to coincide, needs to be congruent. And if I find that if there's some sort of, unleveling or mishap, or, like one thing is one way and the other thing is another, that to me makes one of my eyebrows go up. And when that starts to happen, when I start to get suspicious, your next move, your next step, your next words will account for how I see you after that.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, and with those meeting expectations, again, I think you're right. If you say X, then you need to do X. And if that's not how it goes, now we start making, and we'll talk about this, but attributions. Was that a mistake? Did you not realize? Or are you being devious? Are you trying to trick me? Are you malicious? What is the motivation behind that mismatch? And so then that's when you figure out, like, is trust going to get violated, and is it ever able to be repaired? Because it very much depends on how I interpret that situation. Yeah, for sure. So you're actually, this is alluding to a couple of the other insights that are coming along here. So I'll keep moving so that we can get through these slides. But one of the other insights we had, for some, trust is very holistic, right? You either trust a person or you do not. You are trusting a person. And that doesn't really matter if it's work or if it's at home. You need to trust them as a person. So it's all or nothing in some cases. For others, and this is something I found I can myself do, and I don't know if it's cultural or if it's individual, but compartmentalizing, right? So I've got some friends that I don't really like to, I find them to be good friends. I've decided I no longer want to work with them. I've worked with them in certain cases. I really like them as a person. I've decided their work style doesn't work for me. I've got people that are the other way. I like working with them, but really wouldn't think that they're going to be my friend on the side. That's not really, we have a very professional relationship, right? And so I can compartmentalize those things, but not everyone can. A lot of people are like, it doesn't matter which context you burn me in, our relationship is done, right? So there's some interesting differences there in terms of what you're dealing with. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question. Does age, generation have something to do with this as well? Because I'm middle-aged, and I'm finding that as I'm getting older, I'm feeling, if across the board, if I lose it, I want to lose it. You know, that trust. And when you say family, that's another thing. And I will break off family if need be. I will cut off an arm. That's how loyal I am. To put a fealty on myself. you
Yeah.
know, much less a coworker or, you know, someone of that nature.
Yeah, that is a great question that I don't have an answer to. I have not looked into the literature on age and the generation stuff gets tricky. It's really hard to separate age and life phase from generation, and so it's hard to know which one's causing differences when you look at those groups. But that would be an interesting thing to look into. I'm not sure if there's differences there. There was something that triggered another thought. Oh, but yes, speaking to like willingness to essentially like cut off or to turn your back on family, you do see very big differences. And I think, again, this is anecdotal to some extent in culture there, and that some cultures are very like nuclear family oriented. And so cutting off extended family is like, okay, you can do that. That is like literally fabric of certain societies. Like that would be like unheard of in certain cases where like extended family is quite literally the underpinning of societal values, right? Where like that's more important. So it just depends. And then of course there's people who go, screw this culture, I don't like it, I'm gonna do it different. So all right, very interesting. Okay, so now the fun part, what breaks trust? And this is, it sounds exciting because it's like, ooh, this is the scary part, right? But it's really simple. Again, it's not meeting expectations. It really comes down to just the opposite. But there's research that broadly breaks types of violation into two kinds, where you can have can do or will do violations, right? Violations in your ability to follow through with what's expected of you. And this is, again, in a collaborative working setting. This makes more sense. It's a little, doesn't apply as much in personal relationships, but those competence violations are more like mistakes or a lack of competency on your part that could be trained up. You didn't mean to do it that way, you just weren't able to. Versus integrity violations. You are doing it because you have chosen not to. You had the skills, you knew you should, you just did not, which is a much bigger issue, right? Those integrity or will do violations, that's where all the problems come about. Competence violations, much easier to fix after the fact, more likely to be attributed to the external situation than an integrity violation. Overall, trust violation as a process it tends to be theorized as involving a cognitive causal attribution process. I alluded to this earlier. When we experience something like this, our first like sort of train of thought is like, why did it happen? Did it happen because it was purposeful or not purposeful? And that's a big difference. If it's intentional, if that violation was intentional, that's going to cause huge damage to the relationship, right? If it's accidental or for some reason we can give them the benefit of the doubt of it being accidental, then it's possible it could be recovered depending on a bunch of other things like severity of the outcomes and how many times it's happened, et cetera, right? So and we won't do a break for this one, but if any of you have got some examples, can you think of a time when someone at work, specifically in a collaborative working context, and obviously keep names to yourself here, especially if any of you work together, can you think of a time when someone lost it? What did they do? Why did it make you stop trusting them? And how did it affect you? And while you think, I'll give an example. And the student that this happened with is very aware of this, so I'll throw this out there as an example. I had a graduate student, fantastic, super competent, really, really, really engaged, doing great work. Started thing off on the side, not in any intentionally malicious way, just being almost political capital, like saying things in order to like open doors and using information that benefited them. And I had never really said you shouldn't do that. Maybe this is a mentoring mistake on my part. You shouldn't go around saying things about your team to other people that could look bad. But we found out through secondhand means that was happening. So we actually had to sit down a student and be like, listen, what you did was not okay. It's sort of damaging the culture of our organization because people are now afraid to say things. That confidentiality expectation is being violated. Explain to us why you were doing this, or did you even realize you were doing it? And part of it was complete unawareness. They're just talking and having fun and didn't realize what they were saying was having harmful impacts. And then number two, again, just not really thinking through the level of ramification. They just didn't understand the nuances of how reputation works and how this could affect reputation, et cetera. And we got very quick turnaround when we addressed that issue, right? So it was a little awkward, had to very like head on confront the issue, tell this person that they had violated expectations, but we have had a very good response since then, at least I think we have, with that individual, and we're now back in a very positive working relationship. So that's an example more of an unintentional, non-task related violation, and it was an integrity violation, but not intentional, if that makes sense, that we experienced. It looks like we've got a story. Signed a contract, delays. Oh yeah. So yeah, basically not following through with a particular, like with a contract that was expected. That breaking contracts, and that's an explicit violation in that case, right? That's a big problem. Oh yes, competing when you should be lifting up or collaborating. That's a big one. Right, and you see that just in particular fields where there's competitiveness as a culture, and so you get issues with that. Any other examples? Oh yeah. Yeah, and so when an organization violates, trust like that in a way, you can end up having turnover because you've lost the loyalty of that employee. So you've got to be really careful with that kind of stuff. But yeah, it can have a big impact. So we'll keep on moving here. All right, so that's the trust violation piece. And you'll notice it's short because again, there's no new lessons here other than if you don't do the stuff you were supposed to do in the first place, you will break trust. We did look at, again, some of the outcomes of this, like how do people's reactions differ in terms of when you break trust? And what you see, again, is obviously like withdrawal of what was already there. So if you were delegating, you were collaborating, you were being open, you see removal of that openness, people start being more standoffish, they start pulling tasks away from that person because they don't want them touching whatever they messed up. But you also see, again, in more egregious versions of this, you'll see people, membership changes, trying to get out of teams or change teams, get out of the situation that you were in. And you'll also just see a lot of cognitive resource drain where people are now worried about things and they're ruminating on the violation, and it's really just taking up a lot of space in their brain with that violation. And if you've ever looked into the team conflict literature, I think trust violation and conflict are probably the two different versions of the same thing, or maybe one's a specific version of another. But that literature really speaks to that same thing, where like when you experience conflict, you can get into these terrible cycles of ruminating on it and of allowing that to color perceptions of the future. And so now we're like confirmation bias and we're seeing it where it isn't even there, and it can become a big issue. Oh yeah, so again, like saying one thing, saying that there's sort of an open door policy, you could do that, but when that meeting's arranged, they're not really listening. They're not actually like willing to have that voice be heard. All right. Okay, so then if this happens, if trust has been violated, whether you did it or someone else did it to you, what restores trust? And this is another super interesting area of research, in my opinion, because the research and the world don't quite match up in this one. So there is a recent review that covered all of the literature of trust repair in organizational settings, came out in 2017, Lewicki and Brinsfield, and they summarize both short-term and long-term approaches or techniques for restoring trust. And you probably wouldn't be surprised that the vast majority of the trust repair research focuses on apologies, on verbal statements of being sorry, etc. So they break this up into verbal statements. Apologies as a specific type of verbal statement. Compensation and denial are four of the most commonly studied strategies for repairing trust. So verbal statements are basically any verbal explanation, excuse, statement meant to directly address the violation, and it's assumed that the goal is to allow the relationship to move on. Now, of course, that's not always what is happening after a trust violation. Sometimes it's escalated or it's defended or whatever, but in this case, we're assuming that the goal is to somehow fix the relationship. Apologies are the most commonly looked at verbal statement. Any kind of statement that includes statements of remorse, regret, guilt, and generally a promise of changed behavior. That's what makes up an apology. Compensation is something, again, that's studied, and I think this might be driven by Western settings quite a bit, where you provide some sort of tangible compensation to make up for the violation. This makes a little more sense at the organizational level, like when an organization violates something, they may actually pay out, or there's a grievance, or there's a legal ramification that comes along with compensation. This is a little weirder in interpersonal dynamics, right? Can you imagine like violating your friend's trust and so you just try to pay them off for it? That might be kind of strange, right? And so I don't know if compensation applies in a lot of our settings. Yeah, Paul, you have a question?
It's not a question so much as a comment. I actually have used tangible compensation, but what I will do is I will buy them a personalized gift,
right,
with a handwritten note,
mm-hmm.
And I think that is showing. So when you say compensation, it's not just cash. It's not about the cash.
Right.
It's about that I went and got her favorite dessert at Panera.
Right.
Wrote her a note and said, I am so sorry. And when you're ready to talk about it, I'm here to listen. I don't want to lose you as a friend. I'm so sorry this happened.
Right.
Like, so it's like, I want to say a love gift because I'm not sure, but it's not cash.
Right.
So can you just clarify for us, when you say compensation here, do you just kind of mean that? And then I'll also add, from my understanding of other cultures, there actually is something to the equivalent of blood money. Like when you do a really bad wrong, there actually is blood money that is allowed to let people move on, as a way of acknowledging the damage that you've done. So can I get your comments on both of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that in the research that's being summarized here, compensation tends to be that very tangible, like the idea being that it gives some sort of a tangible, or not necessarily financial, but at least benefits that person in a tangible way reward. Whereas I think what you're speaking to, again, it's like the gift it's more about the thoughtfulness. Like you could have handmade it and it doesn't matter that it's not worth anything monetarily. The gift is the piece. It's not a compensation so much as it is an act of benevolence that also is serving as, and again, you're saying handwritten note, you're pairing it with like behaviors and statements that are supposed to show that remorse and that promise of changed behavior. And so I think what's funky here is, you don't have these clean divides between some of these categories, but it's the motivations and what's meant to be portrayed. Like what signal are you sending? So there's some research on signal theory, right? Like what signal are you trying to send with that? And it's the signal that really matters. Now that said, I don't know if the research has gotten into that yet. Like the research has been very superficial. Like they do a lot of vignette studies in this area of literature and haven't gotten into the real world very much, where they say like, imagine if your friend did X and then they did Y to try and fix it, and you respond to that. And I'm like, well, that's not quite how the world works, right? So right now, this area of literature is a little underdeveloped. The blood money piece. So that's super interesting. I bet you there's lots of research on that more in like anthropological, sociological research areas that I'm not as familiar with. I don't think, again, this very Western-driven area of research has gotten into that as much, but it'd be super interesting to look at those differences across cultures and like why there's differences and what the signals are that are trying to be sent there. So that's super interesting. All right, and then the last one on this page. So again, this is where I think that there's a mismatch between the literature and the science and what's really needs to be looked at, honestly. Denial. So another strategy that's looked at in the literature and quite a bit is just straight up denying that the thing ever happened. And I'm like, how could this possibly be helpful in most actual practical settings? And so I have this caveat here that I would personally only recommend it for the truly innocent. I do not think trying to get away with a denial when a violation actually occurred would be helpful. And honestly, it doesn't even matter if it happened. So in most of these cases, if someone has perceived a slight or perceived a violation, you could sit there and argue until you're blue in the face that you didn't actually do it or you didn't mean it that way, but you're past that point. You're to the point of the relationship being damaged, right? So at the very least, there needs to be an acknowledgement of the perceived hurt, whether or not you think you did it as the violator, right? Now, of course, this is hard to train and to get people to be like, well, I don't want to admit I did wrong and I don't think I did. And you're like, well, what's your goal? Is it to get to the relationship being functional again, or is it to be right? So, but there is research that, and again, it's sort of rough research that shows that if there is a situation, and so you'll see in these studies, they'll do things like, it'll be information about someone you're hiring. And so the trust violation's like in the past, and it's like on their resume, or it's like hearsay. And so it's not actually confirmed that this person did this bad ethical thing. And so if you can deny that, then you can get away with it. But that's, again, it's just such a, the situation assumes that there is no way to actually confirm it occurred. And if there is a way to confirm it occurred, like this whole approach just goes out the window. It's not very helpful. And I think there was a mention, sorry, there's been a lot of chat, but I did see something about like apologies not being enough. And I will get to that in a second, and that I think you're right. But apologies are often part of the package, I will say. And there is some research on what makes an apology effective or ineffective. And then an effective apology can't just be the word sorry in most cases. It's just, especially if it's perceived as inauthentic, that will do more harm than good. So you need that expression of regret, an explanation of the violation, if that explanation helps, right? If the explanation is, I really was trying to screw you over, maybe that will not be so helpful. But if it is, I really didn't mean to do this, I had so many things coming down on me, I missed the deadline, not because I don't care about our project, but because of this other stuff on the side, and I've fixed it now, and I plan not to do it in the future, that actually does help. Like, we get it when people have hard times. But if you don't explain that, we often make attributions that like it wasn't about those external factors. An acknowledgement of the responsibility. I feel like in so many contexts, it really doesn't matter which one. Again, it doesn't matter if you truly did it, but you've got to at least acknowledge that like you are involved, and that from that person's perspective, you need to take some of that responsibility on. Declaring declarations of repentance that you didn't want to do it, that you don't want to do it again. And I put office here, but that should be offer of repair. An office of repair. That sounds very formal. And then a request for forgiveness. It helps, again, to like, if you ask for the forgiveness, now the person has to either say, no, I won't, or they have to go, well, maybe I'll consider it. And now if I say I will, no, I have to follow through with my side. And so maybe I'll give you that benefit of the doubt and try to work on this relationship. But again, this research tends to pit these against each other. It tends to be comparative research. It's like, which is better, an apology or a denial? And you're like, well, that's kind of a false dichotomy, right? They also talk about long-term strategies here. I don't even really need to go through these, but structural arrangements, which is more like making the risk go away, right? Instead of fixing the relationship, you put formal policies or procedures in place that limit the possibility of this going wrong again. So this is almost like circumventing trust more than it is repairing trust, but it reduces the need for it, essentially. They mention reframing, attempts to, and again, these words make me feel, ooh. Attempts to shift blame, explain away, or minimize perceptions of damage. I think there is a way to do that in the right way when again, something was truly unintentional or there were external factors at play. There's a way to reframe that in a way that still acknowledges the hurt, gives that person voice, lets their grievance be heard, but also says, okay, I totally get it. That must have sucked from your perspective. If I thought that's what had happened, I would be hurt too, but here's how I saw it, right? Forgiveness, so signaling a willingness to preserve the relationship. This is more from the person that is forgiving's perspective. And then again, they mention silence, like just avoiding it, which again, I would not recommend that basically ever. It's only helpful. They mention even here that it's only helpful if you need time to build an alibi or you need to hide evidence. I don't even know why they mentioned this in the literature. It was very weird to me when I was reading this review. I'm like, why is this in here?
What about if it's that you're keeping a secret? Then staying silent is a good thing to do, isn't it?
Right. So again, I would label that as maintaining confidentiality, which is a little different from how they were framing this silence piece, which is post-transgression. You just don't acknowledge the thing that happened in the hopes that eventually something will happen where you can deny it appropriately. It's like the waiting game until you can deny, which again, I found this feels very shady to me. So we did our own research in the ARI grant and actually asked people like, what repairs trust for you, right? Like when you have repaired trust, when these stories have happened, what has worked? And I think you guys alluded to this already. It's not a one or the other thing. It's an all of the above approach. It's most trust, when trust is repaired, it's repaired in a number of different ways. It takes time and repetition of those acts of benevolence, etc. Because we were focused on work settings in particular, not personal relationships, you saw the phrase going above and beyond used repeatedly. If you mess up in a project team and you somehow hurt the project, right? You dropped the ball, you missed the deadline, you did poor quality work, whatever it happens to be, the best way to fix that is to step it up for a while, right? To really show people a renewed sense of commitment to the team, to show that whatever you did was unintentional and you do have the capability and the willingness to do it better moving forward. So going back to minimum expectations of performance is very much necessary. Bumping it up and picking up the slack or adding a little extra on top or really like pushing things through quickly, that really helps that going above and beyond piece. But you also saw the other things you would expect. Sincere apologies for whatever you messed up in the team, taking responsibility for your misstep or for the mistake made, providing an explanation. So many of these things, again, right, come down to, well, they ghosted us for 3 weeks. I don't know where this team member went. Oh, well, they had a huge family issue and they were dealing with it, but they told no one, so nobody knew to cut them some slack at that moment, right? So a lot of it just comes down to that transparency. If it was something more integrity-based, so showing extra kindness or benevolence, if for some reason you're all of a sudden questioning their character, like, are you actually here to help us or are you selfish? Well, okay, no, you misinterpreted. I wasn't being selfish. This is what I meant to be doing. And then showing that extra kindness or benevolence. And then I'll mention the adjusting expectations because that's almost the flip side. So in most cases of trust restoration, it requires the violator to do something and to do something of their own volition in an authentic way where they really mean that they're sorry and they really want to fix things. There were some instances where we heard people describing, and I guess this is maybe an individual difference, well, I guess I just expected too much of them in the first place, so I just stopped expecting that, right? And so the relationship continued and there was outcomes of productivity, but what happened is that the trustor lowered their expectations because they realized they were expecting too much of that particular individual. And I think that tended to happen more in the competence area, right? Where like maybe you just put too much on one of your newer team members and you didn't realize what their limits were, right? And so you can sometimes see trust repaired from that perspective. But overall, all these things sort of happened in some combination. People were using like packages of trust repair, right? And it often took a little while for it to work. It wasn't instant. It wasn't like one apology and one day later you were good. It took a little while to see that consistent behavior over time. All right. Whoops. Oh yeah. So then any stories then from you all in terms of relationships that maybe were a little rocky, but you got it back to a good place at work where you were able to repair trust after some sort of a violation occurred?
This is definitely the harder part.
Yeah.
And that's probably why we're all here.
Yeah.
But I would say talking, communication, or maybe even distancing to help out.
Yeah. Sometimes you need a moment to cool down, to separate, so that you can come at it a little more rationally later. Yeah, and it depends on how emotional the situation was, right?
Perhaps having third party involved.
Yeah. And again, these are very similar themes to what you see in the conflict and conflict management literatures. So I think there's a piece of this that's all the same thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to, like, you don't know if you've repaired a relationship, but if you're the person whose trust was lost, that's going to be the perspective that knows if it was repaired. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, this one is definitely harder. Go ahead, Paula.
The other thought that occurs to me too is maybe how much of you're a trust giver versus initial mistrust person.
Mm-hmm.
How would that impact that? So I'm one of those people that just automatically trusts everybody. And then I build on that basic trust level. And the thing that I alluded to in the chat that happened at work, that person really broke my trust. And I cannot imagine how we could repair that relationship back to what it was before.
Right.
And I don't know if that has anything to do with, my personality, being Scorpio. I'm just joking, but, or, being someone who gives a lot of trust. So then when you break it, you've really broken it, versus someone who already starts from more of a mistrusty thing. So when you break their trust, they're not as surprised, so they're not as hurt.
Right.
So those are the thoughts going through my head.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think you're right. And one of the other themes we pulled out of the interviews was that for some people, especially like, you know, obviously it depends on severity of violation, but for some people it was like, it doesn't matter what you do from here on out. Like once you burn me, it is burned. And then other people were a lot more willing to give people a second or third or a fourth chance, right? So you see very big individual differences in that. And you also see, and again, I think a good part of that is probably either culturally or individually driven by how many bad experiences you've had over time. Like, do you expect to get burned? Do you always assume that every violation must be intentional? Right, so you can almost start moving towards paranoia a little bit in certain personality types, or after certain like aggregation of experiences over time. It definitely differs across people. We saw wildly different responses depending on the person. Yeah, so let me check out the chat. Yes, and so that's the other, we also found plenty of comments when we asked people why they trusted other people, similarity across the board, whether it was similarity in actual demographic background, they're from the same country, the same town I grew up in, or we met and started talking, we both love these interests, or we both have this similar set of values we've discovered. You see that similarity often bonded people, either initially or later as they started to realize that they were more similar. Yeah. Yeah, and the competence and integrity distinction is a big one. Again, I think the literature does tend to emphasize that competence, you can fix, it can be retrained, you can change your expectations or clarify the task or whatever it happens to be. But if a person's a bad person or is malicious, that's much harder to recover from. All right, I think we got about 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure I still touch on the psychological safety piece. So just a couple of final slides in the trust piece, where you'll notice that what I've talked about so far is basically just interpersonal trust. It's actually mostly pulled from the literature on dyadic trust relationships, but when you talk about it in teams, not much changes fundamentally. What changes is the complexity, right? So it's the same as trust in dyadic relationships. It just gets more complicated, and that the lack of trust in even one team member may make you negative, may color your view of the team as a whole, right? Especially if that person has particular sway, or it's the leader of the team, or whatever's happening in that team. You basically can have these, and I love this picture, spillover effects, where trust violation that happens between two parties can actually impact third parties in the team or the team as a whole, right? If two people are having it out in the middle of the team, there's possibility of coalition formation where we're starting to say, well, you're going to be on my side. What do you think? Don't you agree with me? Well, no, I don't agree with you. And you get these subgroup formations that can happen. And in general, you can also just have third parties' perspectives change. You may not have been the victim of the violation directly, but because you observed it, that's changed your perception of that individual's integrity or of that individual's benevolence, right? And so in a team, you just end up with these higher level social dynamics that can really make this more complicated. It doesn't change what the expectations are for the most part, or how these processes occur. It just changes who's really experiencing them and how complicated it can get. Okay, and then psych safety, since it was in the title. I spend a lot less time on this because I think, again, trust and psychological safety are so intertwined that if you're building one, you're probably by definition building the other based on the way that you have to build those norms. But psychological safety is specifically more of a climate variable. Trust is like an attitude or a perception we have in terms of our interpersonal relationships, where psychological safety is usually referring to the team level climate that you have in your working group, right? And it's the feeling that in this group, in this setting, it's safe for me to take interpersonal risks. And what we mean by interpersonal risks in this situation is to share a thought or an idea, to pitch something new, to push back on somebody else's idea without the group coming at me and telling me I'm stupid or shutting my idea down or socially ostracizing me, right? That I can have voice without there being negative social ramifications. I tend to boil this down to a culture of there are no dumb ideas, but it's not just ideas, it's voiced more holistically, right? Of course, this is important to balance. Our goal is psychological safety because it's been shown over and over again to be very beneficial in teams. Actually, Google did some research on what makes the most effective teams in the Google workplace, and they thought it was going to be technical skills. They thought when you have the best and brightest minds together in a team, that team's going to be the best team. Nope, didn't turn out to have anything to do with technical skills. It was all about which teams were psychologically safe, had clear roles and responsibilities, and clear tasking, right? Like it all came down to how the team was working and not really the skills on the team. The teams that outperformed others had the psych safety piece. They were a safe space to push new ideas. That said, it's important to balance this with what I would call healthy constructive criticism. The idea of having a culture of no dumb ideas doesn't mean you accept every single idea and use it, right? You still have to work through those things, but there's a way of framing this. There's a way of engaging in this kind of constructive debate that gets you to better outcomes. And so you probably have heard this if you've seen anything about how you give people feedback, and that feedback should be focused on the behavior or the task and not the person, right? People are more receptive to criticism or constructive ideas if you're framing it around what they're doing or saying and not them. So consider the sandwich approach to criticism, where you're sort of putting those ideas in a positive, negative, positive frame, right? So if someone brings up an idea, you thank them for bringing up that idea. You make sure that it is known that they should be speaking up, that voice is appreciated. If you have something to say about it, hey, I wonder though, given that idea, I see this challenge with it, or maybe here's this limitation or this gap. What do you think about that? How would we get around it, right? I really like that thought, but do you see a way to address my concern? Like there's just some subtle ways in the way that we frame our language in order to make sure that people feel like they can put things out there. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be accepted face value, but that it's a safe place to work through those ideas. Okay, and so that's literally all I have on psych safety, and that it really does come down to that. It's just a matter of setting a climate in your group where people aren't feeling like they are not allowed to speak, or if they do speak, there's going to be negative ramifications. And that the easiest way to do this is just to keep an eye on how you are communicating to set those explicit expectations around this kind of a culture. So the overall, too long didn't read, of my entire presentation, to build trust and psychological safety in teams. This is my sort of quick list of tips. Learn about your team members as people, right? So do that social bonding time, actually get to know them a little bit. Obviously, there's some caveats here in that it's not always that easy to fit in more time. Everyone's overworked right now, overtaxed, I get that. But even the smallest amount of time put towards social bonding is really helpful. Within that, recognizing and appreciating similarities and differences. So I also do work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion area. Optimal distinctiveness is key here. Everyone wants to belong, but they don't want to belong by turning into an automaton. They want to belong as their unique selves and still be that unique self, right? And so we need to recognize differences and then not just accept them or tolerate them. That is terrible language, right? We want to appreciate them and really see the value that those differences bring to our teams. And then number one, discuss and reconcile expectations up front. In work settings, to some extent, again, if you're not getting what you want out of your team, you're just gonna have to look and see, can you figure out what's not being met as an expectation, and hopefully fix that with some explicit communication, really confronting violations head on, getting people to realize what they should be doing and why what they're doing is not meeting those expectations. But the goal overall is to be all the good things still. Like it's not super complicated, and that we want all of our coworkers and ourselves to be nice and benevolent, honest, helpful, dependable, high performers, right? So if you can be all of the things, that's probably the easiest way to get to that place. Yes, I can send the slides to Chris and Lauren later. And then when it comes to those expectations, if you are the person that knows you are not about to meet those expectations, then give fair warning and explanation. Don't wait until after you've dropped the ball to explain why it happened. If you can warn people ahead of time, that they may be able to reorient and do backup behavior to cover it for you. And maybe they'll be happy to do that, and it actually makes them feel bonded to you, right? But if you just go, oh, I don't know, I'm probably gonna miss this deadline, but I'm not even gonna think about it. Whoops, I missed it, right? That's when violations happen. If others don't meet your expectations, try to be that right amount of forgiving. Don't get trampled on. Don't let people just do whatever they want. Obviously, you need to get to high performance at some point. But assume that there could be an explanation that you don't know, that it could be external circumstances, or maybe they're just not aware of the fact that that expectation was in place, right? So if you can give people that little bit of the benefit of a doubt, you know, at least the first time around, that's really helpful for recovering those relationships. And then with the psych safety, encouraging all team members to contribute ideas and praise those contributions when they do make them. Even if you do have critiques around them, that's totally okay as well. But that's my sort of short list of ways to build trust and psych safety. All right, and that is the end of my slides with 3 minutes to spare. All right, what else do we have? Any questions, thoughts, other contributions? Here, I'll stop this since I don't need slides now. Nothing else? All right. Well, I think with that, we are done. So I assume, Chris, Lauren, that we just sign off from here. Do you have anything else you have to say?
Yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful session. I think Lauren will be sending out a kind of review, give us your thoughts on this last session. And those are really important for us so we can develop the sessions as we go forward. So thank you, Jessica, so much for this wonderful session. There it is.
Of course, it was fun. Thank you all.